Hello, hello. Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, or night, I guess, depending on where you are. Welcome to Discord Q&A number 36. Let's get in there. Starting out, we've got melee Runaans. This is a really interesting topic, especially for me. I'll explain sort of my general philosophy on the topic, and then I'll talk about the sort of story of it, because if you have been paying a lot of attention to the PB over the last few years, or you are an avid watcher of my stream and have done that for over a year, then you might be aware that I actually had a version of Melee Runaan's on the PB for I don't know, like one or two cycles, like a year or two ago, somewhere around there. I don't remember the exact details, but I'll talk about that story in a second after I talk about the sort of more like my philosophy on Melee Runaan's. Generally speaking, the way that I look at Runaan's and like the item system in general, like the way that Runaan's relates to it is we've had a lot of item restrictions in the past around like who is literally allowed to like right click this item in the shop. My take is that generally I believe that we should let the like items be functional as like on characters and like purchasable on characters as much as possible. And we should only remove people's ability to like use an item or buy an item when we believe that there's no other solution or we believe that it's deeply incorrect for them to do so, right? As an example of something I did in this space is Actualizer was supposed to be a payout for stacking a lot of mana and being a mana champion, right? The point of the item, I'm not saying it worked, right? Like just saying philosophically speaking here, the point of the item was to say mana is no longer a disadvantage for you, right? It's not just a resource cost that you pay, it's actually an upside that you get because you have this access to this item. You can turn your mana into upside rather than downside, relative to a resourceless character. And so I said, okay, well, that means that if we want that to be true, like that sort of design structure to be correct, then that means that resourceless characters cannot use Actualizer. And so you can literally buy it on resourceless characters, but you cannot activate it, right? That is how I ended up setting up that item. And Runaan's, I think, exists in a world where it's the only item that is actually still remaining in the game that is restricted from a certain set of champions by like actually physically buying it, right? Which is melees. Melees cannot buy Runaan's. And I am generally of the opinion that we should reduce these restrictions as much as possible because the way that I look at the item system is I kind of look at the item system as having two types of users. One type of user is the less optimized, less experienced, or less interested player for looking at the item system. These types of players will typically do one of two things. Number one is they'll use the recommended item system, in which case restrictions on items don't really matter to them. Number two is they'll use some kind of external tool or website. Maybe they look at Lowalytics, maybe they look at some other website, or maybe they use a tool, whatever, that tells them these are the items you should buy when you're playing this champion, right? Again, doesn't matter how restricted the items are to them. The secondary class of users for items are the optimizers, right? Where we have people that really want to figure out, like, want to deep dive into a champion and figure out like what builds are optimal in which situations, right? These players will gain, over time, and not immediately. Like as they experiment, they will eventually gain win rate, gain literal power by optimizing items because the recommended items and even the items that you get recommended by like Lowalytics will not be optimal in every single situation in every single game, right? You can find ways to optimize, small things. Even optimizing like your build paths can give you small advantages in the long run. In terms of winning the game, winning, slightly more games. Um, and for these players, I think the item system is at its most interesting when it offers them the broadest set of options available. Even if some of those options are not good, that actually isn't important, right? Because their goal is to find the one option that is optimal in a situation. And so, especially with items that are particularly interesting and offer effects that you can't really find elsewhere, like Runaan's, I think it's valuable, even if the item is not super powerful for melees, that they have access to that item because it's just another interesting puzzle piece that we're giving to those item optimizers that are out there that want to fix this puzzle or like solve this puzzle that is what is the correct build in this situation, right? Even giving them a really not very useful puzzle piece in 99% of situations is actually a positive for this player because the puzzle is more interesting the more pieces they have to work with, even if they know going in this piece probably isn't that useful for most melee champions or even 95% of melee champions. Um, and so philosophically speaking, that's kind of how I look at the item system, and that's why I sort of started looking at Runaans and said, hey, could we remove this restriction? Now, looking more specifically, like narrowing down, from a sort of more broad philosophical perspective to more specifically, like what happens if we let Runaans be good on melees? I kind of thought this through, and I was like, okay, so melee champions generally don't buy Zeal items for a number of reasons. We don't need to get into all of that, but it's like, well, these items, even though percent MS is generally better on melee champions than range champions, like from a pure statistical perspective, because melee champions have higher base MS, um, the Zeal items tend to be a lot better on range champions, typically because the Zeal items are pure multipliers, right? They give you a bunch of attack speed, a bunch of crit, and movement speed, and they're very cheap, right? They don't offer a lot of slot efficiency. And they require that you have a lot of other stats elsewhere, right? Like mostly AD, but they require that you have other things to multiply with them, right? There's a reason why no one rushes Zeal items aside from like Yone and Yasuo of the past. And I think actually on live PD first is decent on them. I haven't looked at that in a bit, but there's a reason why people generally don't rush these Zeal items, which is that they are generally multipliers, right? Like they say you attack faster, but if you have no AD, it's not that good, right? And the thing with these melee champions is typically they either want more direct multipliers to their damage, right? This is things like Infinity Edge for Tryndamere, as an example, in their later slots, or they need defenses, right? Talking about like Viego, Belveth type champions, they typically need defenses in their later slots, and so these later slot, like not the bet like secondary multipliers, I guess is how I would describe the Zeal items, like secondary multipliers. They're good multipliers, but they're not as good as Infinity Edge. Typically, the melee champions are either going to go for the big hits, right? That'd be like Infinity Edge for Tryndamere in second slot or third slot. Um, or they're going to go for things that offer them defenses, that aren't even necessarily crit items, or are crit items like shield bow, or are crit items that offer them some other kind of utility that's particularly effective for them. Um, anyway, don't need to get into all of that, but generally these Zeal items tend to be relatively low appeal to melee champions, and so if we could create one that would have some appeal, that seems like an upside to me, because I think giving melee champions an item that requires them to trade off on their defensive stats, and gives them a utility effect that is not pure damage, right? It's not Phantom Dancer. It seems like upside. And so when I was looking at this initially, I said, okay, so some of the concerns that people had were like, oh, well, does this mean that like Tryndamere has a lot of wave clear, too much wave clear? And my answer to that, like looking through that, was like, okay, well, do we care if Tryndamere has better wave clear? He buys Tiamat items and has been buying Tiamat items for a long time on live. Do we care if like Lane Viego has better wave clear because he buys Runaans? No, right? Because by the time this thing comes in for these champions, typically it's second item. And we even did some, I'm jumping a little bit ahead. Let me not jump ahead. But we did some experimentation around like what happens when like Yone or Yasuo buys this. Is this a lot of wave clear? And the conclusion was, well, Runaan's wave clear for melees is not even as good as buying a Tiamat item. And the Tiamat items are shaped to be a lot better as first items than Zeal items, even for Yone Yasuo. And so the conclusion ended up being, well, this isn't really breaking anything in terms of wave clear breakpoints, and maybe we'd even be happy if Tryndamere, had a build where he went Runaans for wave clear instead of a Hydra item. And so I kind of looked at this and I said, okay, well, let me spend some time, and let me, this is where I'm going to tell the story of what actually happened with melee Runaans. But let me spend some time working this together, like making a functional prototype of a melee Runaans, put it in tests, and actually see what happens, right? Because some people had some very valid concerns. What I was talking about earlier was like, hey, what like, does this mean that Yone and Yasuo have really powerful wave clear, but also get their crit spike first item? So I spent a few hours. The Runaan script is very complicated. Most of our items, actually, interestingly enough, are fairly straightforward. Like from a script perspective, they're not that complicated, but we have probably like 10% of the items or something like that are like occupy 95% of the complexity of the item system from a script perspective, and Runaan's is definitely one of those items. There's the 80-20 rule people say, that's like more of a QA principle of like in your software, 80% of your complexity is typically going to be at about 20% of your the area, 20% of your structure. I think it's even more extreme than that for items, and Runaan's is very complicated. And I had to massage some of the rules to even make it make sense. Something I would recommend is if you're interested in how Runaan's work sort of under the hood, take a look at the wiki. I think the wiki probably still has a nice diagram of how Runaan's bolts actually decide like what they're going to target, like how it prioritizes targeting. But a lot of those things kind of broke down when I was saying, hey, let's make this function on melee champions. For what it's worth, also, this is another irrelevant tangent, and I do love getting into those. From what I'm told, I wasn't there when the original Runaans was made, but from what I'm told, the reason why it was disabled on melees from the very beginning was that the original version of it just literally did not work on that. Like it was literally non-functional, and so it was just disabled because the perspective at the time was like, well, we're intending this for ranged champions, and it literally does not work on melees at all. Like from a script perspective, and so we're just going to disable it. And then it's been rescripted multiple times since then, but that was always just a holdover from the original, and no one ever tried to make it work on melees until I actually did that. So it took a good amount of effort, and I had to, rewrite some of the rules and establish some like minimums for some of the targeting parameters, et cetera, et cetera. And I also did do a pass on like simplifying some of the rules because I think it's probably a little bit overcomplicated how the bolts choose their target. But anyway, so I did some massaging. That probably took me like, I don't know, 3 hours, 2 hours, somewhere in there. I don't remember. This was a while ago. And I put this into tests. And most of what happened in tests was we tried it out and it was either totally fine, or well, this actually doesn't seem that good. Once I established some good tuning levers, as an example, the original version that I put into testing, where Belveth E worked at full effect for the bolts, that was really messed up. Because Belveth E didn't reduce the damage, like the modifier on her E didn't reduce the damage of the bolts, and so that was like, I don't know if you call that a bug or just like the functionality of Runaan's technically, because that's sort of how it works on live. But I basically said, okay, yeah, these bolts now are affected by on hit modifiers, uh, and that solved, like, basically resolved a lot of the problem cases that we were, or, well, not a lot, the one problem case that we solved, just like, yeah, Belveth E was just doing way too much damage with Runaan's. Um, and I changed some rules, like under the hood stuff that really didn't affect the ranged champions much at all, to like make things work. But we ran into two simultaneous issues. I think one of them was pretty solvable, and the other one was more of a timing thing. The first issue, which I think a lot of people noted when it was on the PB, was, hey, Master Yi goes kind of crazy with this thing because of Double Strike. Now, I'm not as concerned about that as I think a lot of other people were, like after seeing some of the crazy stuff that Master Yi was doing on the PB. The main thing that I think was concerning was like, yes, the absolute top upper end of this is like Master Yi spends a lot of time alpha striking. That's fair. That's a little concerning, right? He's spending a lot of time untargetable because the bolts are giving him more refund on his Q. The thing is, though, uh, that version of Master Yi is buying an item that has a bunch of attack speed and crit on it, and has to be hitting someone who has other targets close to them, right? And so, like, yeah, I guess it's good for clearing the jungle. Like, you'll just clear the jungle pretty quickly, but like, there's lots of items that Master Yi can buy to clear the jungle quickly, and for it to be powerful in PvP combat, where the untargetable aspect of it is really strong, there had to be multiple people stacked on top of each other or very close to each other, and that range that the bolts would target at was tunable, right? And so it's like, well, if that was too powerful, I could bring that range in a little bit, and that would moderate like how frequently Master Yi would actually get into the situation where he was able to, Q auto Q, basically like get that refund process going like really powerfully. And so that one was like, it was a little bit concerning from a gameplay perspective, but I think it was probably solvable, both with tuning on Runaan's or potentially even just some rules, right? Like as an example, we could say, hey, Runaan's doesn't work when you're untargetable. And that makes sense to me, partially because the Runaan's is actually represented by a physical object that hovers over your shoulder, right? The little yellow dot that like fires bolts. And so we could say, hey, it's rules change. Runaan's doesn't work when you're untargetable. And so therefore, Master Yi, you have to actually attack people in order to get this refund, right? So, and that wouldn't really affect the range champions because there's who's buying Runaan's and going untargetable and attacking people while they're untargetable, right? Like, does that affect anyone else? I don't think so, or at least I didn't think so at the time. Maybe there is some like weird edge case that that breaks, and maybe that wouldn't be an acceptable solve. But regardless, I think we could have resolved that gameplay or mitigated that. And I'm not even confident that that would have been, truly devastating in terms of just like how often, as Master Yi, do you get to hit someone who is standing on top of other targets, and they don't spread out, and you get to get a lot of value out of spam untargetability over and over and over again because they can just move away from each other, right? And if it's a minion, you'll probably kill it pretty quickly because you're hitting it with all this damage. The second problem, and I think this was the real, like, actual nail in the coffin, and why I pulled it off the PB, and like, basically, like, undid the changes, didn't even like icebox them, right? I didn't even like pull them into my personal files, and hold them for later, which was uh, there were a lot of bugs. There were a lot of melee champions that just did really weird stuff with Runaans that I did not have time to fix, and more importantly, our QA did not have time to validate. And what we ran into at the time was there were a lot of just weird interactions with champions like GP or Alawi, where their their passives or their effects on, like, Alawi's W, tentacle slam stuff's like, a lot of their effects were just never designed to be able to support them buying Runaans, and so it probably would have required meaningful levels of rescripting to, like, Gangplank passive or Alawi's W tentacle slam, or probably another like 10 to 20 different melee champion effects, where uh the QA did an initial pass on, like, okay, how much work is it going to be to validate this stuff, and the immediate response was like, wow, this is a lot of work, and we're way too busy to do this right now. And ultimately, I think the answer is, if we found a time and a place where QA and design had extra resources and we felt like this was the most valuable thing to do with those resources, we could do it. But the conclusion that we came to at the time was, well, from a philosophical perspective and from a gameplay perspective, this seems like it would probably be upside, right? Like, as an example, if we ever got a world where Tryndamere was buying Runaans and building his rage faster, I feel like that would be pretty cool, right? If that he was doing that instead of buying a Tiamat item or whatever, right? It's like, and if Belveth bought it because she wanted to team fight better and have more splash damage, cool. That would be great, right? Like, from a general perspective, I think most people were on board with the idea of, like, it would be valuable if we could remove this restriction. But when the trade-off is, potentially over a month of live QA time to validate this, and you're talking about like 5 to 10, probably maybe more hours of design, rescripting, potentially, might even need engineering to do some changes to champion, like, melee champions that were just never designed with this effect in mind. uh, it was pretty clear at the time, like, okay, this is not worth it, right? Like, this is not worth the time and the effort. Those hours, like, those QA hours, those design resources, potentially those engineering resources, would just be better spent elsewhere. I personally do still hold out hope that we can make this work at some point when we have some of those resources, right? Like, as an example, some things I've done before is like, well, hey, the 5 to 10 hours of design work, or whatever the design work is in question, it's like, there are days where I just go in early or I stay later, whatever, and I spend an hour or two working on some side project because I think it's worth the time and worth the effort. But when that starts to infringe upon others people's time, that's a whole different story, right? Like, as an example here, the Dark Seal slash Medjai's changes that are going to, I think they're on the PB right now. Maybe they're even live. I don't remember the exact details. Where the items actually track the AP on the item instead of making you do math to see how much AP they have. Those are something that I've wanted to do for quite some time. I found the time to do them like a couple months ago, and I basically sat around, like, waiting and fixed bugs, waiting for live QA to have free time to give me, like, hey, here's a problem you need to fix, and I would go in early and fix those. And that's generally how I operate. Is like, uh, if I have extra time and I think something is worth doing, I do it. But there's a difference between, oh, this will take 10 to 20 minutes of QA time to validate that this thing works in this way, or to find some specific bug with undoing a Medjai's, versus like months and months of time, right? That's a very, very, very different order of magnitude. And so this is just one of those things where that time is probably better spent elsewhere. And I would love to do melee Runaans, but it's a lot of work. Is my ultimate answer to this, or like my ultimate answer. Wow, this is a lot of time. Well, that question will be a lot of the video. Next up, we've got AP Fighter Ult item. This is, like a lot of the general item pitches people give me, is one of those things where I say, well, yeah, if we had a really cool pitch for this, it's the kind of thing I would love to, see or experiment with internally, see how it goes. A lot of item designs, it's very easy to make an item design sound cool, especially when you're giving a vague pitch of like, oh, this is an item for this class that, has this kind of effect, right? Very easy to do that. Making an actually good functional item, a lot harder. Uh, but this pitch, seems like it could have reasonable legs to stand on. The concern I would have, and this was something that did come up when I was working on Fiend Hunter Bolts as an example, is when people can stack ultimate haste items, there's some pretty scary things that happen where it's like, well, previously one of the things to do to counterplay them was to play around their ultimate cooldown window, right? Like, oh, you fight them when it's down, or you force them to blow it in some way, and then you like play around and you have to consume, you have to burn a bunch of resources to get them to blow this ult cooldown, or to deal with them using the ult cooldown, and then you play around the window of it being down. And There's definitely some, I think, very real concerns around what happens when you stack multiples of these, right? And with Fiend Hunter Bolts, the way that I resolved that was I said, okay, this is a Zeal item where the item itself gives attack speed and the effect also gives attack speed. And that linearly scales with Hexplate, where you really don't want a lot of other attack speed in your build for Fiend Hunter Bolts to be good. And so, while yes, theoretically, a champion like Zeri or a champion like Vayne could buy Hexplate and Fiend Hunter Bolts in the same build, and they could have very low cooldown in their ultimate, they're paying a real price in terms of actual combat power in order to do so. Uh, and I think that's pretty important because when they're doing that, they're making the window of counterplay to their ultimate very, 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 very narrow, where we need to be sure that they're paying an appropriate price to get access to that power. And so with an AP Fighter ult item, there's already overlap with two other items, which I think makes this very difficult to navigate, where Malignance is potentially an option for some of these champions, right? Like Gwen, for example. There's been versions of Gwen in the past where Malignance was actually a pretty good first item. And Mordekaiser also has access to Hexplate as well. And so I think we'd have to navigate a space where the AP Fighter ult item would have to not overlap too efficiently with either Hexplate or Malignance, which seems like it would be a really difficult road to walk. Like that seems like it's probably a pretty narrow space. On top of also it needs to be like cool and effective and functional for these champions. And I think the way that I look at this is it is not to say that it is impossible to find something good in that space. It is more if someone were coming to me and they had like five different spaces to work on, or like five different proposals for like item spaces, or like I was looking at my own plans of like, oh, here's 10 different potential spaces I could look at. This would be on my my lower priority list, because I think it's just like making an item in this space would just be really, really like, significantly more difficult because of some of the restrictions that are on you due to the overlap with ult items in other spaces that already can be functionally purchased by AP fighters, right? And again, none of this is to say that like if someone came up with a really cool pitch, like if someone came up with a really cool pitch for this, that I wouldn't say like, oh yeah, let's try it out, right? Like let's see if we can walk that narrow road, like thread that needle basically, like between Malignance and Hexplate, or alternately find a way to resolve hey, what happens when you stack this with another one, right? Like as an example, if this was something that had a long cooldown on its own, like let's suppose it's an ult item that triggers when you ult, but it has in and of itself, it has like a 120-second cooldown. Well, that kind of resolves the issue on its own, right? You just have to make sure that the item is still cool and functional when you do that, right? And so there's like potential mitigations, potential solutions on the table, but you have to make sure that all those things actually work in concert with the item that you make, and the item is still cool and interesting when you apply those those restrictions and those bans to it. And so the way that I look at this, just generally speaking, is there could be something cool in this space, but I think it'd be more difficult to make than a lot of other items that we could make, or item spaces that we could work in. And so this is one where I wouldn't expect, or I would say, I wouldn't say this is a super likely thing to get made, just because even if someone had a really cool pitch, it has to solve a lot of problems, or like has to mitigate a bunch of risk before we would be comfortable with shipping it. But there could be something here. It's a possibility for sure. Could there be room to bring back Kale's AP attack speed scaling to make her less reliant on D&D? So interestingly enough, August, who did the Kale VGU, is the person who both added and removed the AP ratio on to attack speed on her passive, and he did so both for power and for build reasons. And let me explain a little bit of this. One thing to note is that these kinds of ratios, where you are scaling the thing that you are scaling your damage with your damage essentially, right? Like it's a super linear scaling, right? Kale's auto attacks scale with AP, and when she has an AP ratio on her passive that scales attack speed, that also means that AP scales the rate at which she attacks. So you're scaling your attacks with AP in multiple different ways, which is super linear, right? We very rarely do this, right? Like Alawi has this on her E, Volibear has this on his passive, Hecarim has it on his Q, but we very rarely do this for a lot of good reasons. One being that it makes the champions incredibly powerful in terms of scaling, and we typically have to limit that in other ways, right? The way that Volibear and Hecarim and Alawi limit this is, well, especially Volibear and Alawi is like, well, they're not that good at actually, like getting to and sticking on a target. And so them having like really powerful, super linear damage scaling doesn't matter that much ultimately, because they aren't going to be able to stand still and hit you for 5 seconds to get full value out of that. They have to build defenses in order to like actually function. And with Hecarim, we have a whole different setup. Don't need to get into all of that. But anyway, and with Hecarim, by the way, if you didn't know this, it's his Q. His Q has an AD ratio, but also the damage amp from Rampage scales with AD. Very weird. I personally don't love that. I would love to undo that at some point. Anyway, don't need to talk about that. But these types of scalings are extremely powerful. And I think Kale might be one of the most appropriate champions to have this kind of thing because it makes her scale incredibly hard with gold. Because AP is a gold skew. It comes exclusively from gold and I guess like Baron and Runes and stuff like that, right? But it's primarily driven through gold, right? And so this meant that Kale scaled really, really well with gold. In addition to XP, right? Her passive is mega XP scaling, and then this said, okay, well you also scale incredibly well with gold, and it is intentional that she's the premier like late game hyper carry, like she's one of the best, literally best scaling champions in the game, or maybe the best scaling in the game, champion in the game, depending on how you evaluate that. And when we removed this, it was very intentional, and the reason why we removed it is that the way that this structured Kale's builds was it heavily rewards you for just building pure AP, and it makes it so that pure AP build has extremely high DPS. And the way that August wants Kale's builds to be structured, which I think makes a lot of sense, I think I 100% agree with him here, is the on hit focused, like on hit oriented builds that build attack speed on their items should have the highest DPS. And the full AP builds, right? Things like Nashers into Deathcap or like Nashers, Lichbane Deathcap or whatever, should be the highest burst builds, right? Like that should be where, your auto E or like your Q auto E or like your R, auto E, whatever combination you want, where those things have the highest burst. And the problem with the AP ratio to attack speed on her passive was the full AP builds were not just the best at bursting people on Kale, they were also the best at DPSing people, right? Because of that super linear scaling on the passive. And there was no real way for the actual like on hit builds that built a lot of attack speed to compete with the full AP builds because you were just getting so much more powerful, so much more multiplicative scaling on your auto attacks through the scaling of AP. Now, some of this is just due to the raw number that we had, right? One of the things that I noted, to August that we talked about when he was, planning on removing this was, well, attack speed does feel really good. It's the best feeling stat in the entire game. And it's the most feelable, basic stat in the entire game. And so removing this will make people just want to do the full AP build like a lot less, regardless of whether it's the most optimal thing to do or not. People won't want to play it as much as the on-hit build because the on-hit build gets a lot of attack speed, which feels really good. And so there is some consideration here for the the feels of the situation. And to sort of wrap fully back around after I've done a lot of context explanation here around to the actual question here around like less reliance on D&D, I actually don't think that is really how I would look at this, or like really how I would uh like how I like think about the AP to attack speed ratio for Kale. Uh because Dusk and Dawn is basically just saying when you build when you build full AP, this is a way to essentially cheat some attack speed, right? Um, and it is true that if you had an AP to attack speed ratio on your kit, that makes Dusk and Dawn slightly less relatively powerful. But ultimately, it doesn't change the fact that Dusk and Dawn says you apply your on hits an additional time, and so therefore, if you have the most powerful individual on hit, like which is what happens when you build AP on Kale, Dusk and Dawn will still be very powerful, right? It'll still be relatively quite strong. Of course, it has less AP on the item, and so you could try and look at it from that lens of like, well, Dusk and Dawn has less AP on it, and therefore having a really powerful AP ratio on Kale makes this less incentivized. But I'm not really convinced. I'm pretty uncompelled that having this ratio would actually be the way that we would make Kale less D&D less D&D forward, or less make D&D substantially less powerful, because ultimately having that ratio on the passive means building full AP is more powerful. D&D is going to be at its best in the full AP builds, right, that don't get other forms of attack speed. Simultaneously, yes, you can make the argument of like D&D is at its most powerful when the incentive for building AP is on hit damage, or like more of that incentive is in on hit damage. And so you could say, oh, well, if you then nerf the on hit AP ratio and give AP to attack speed on Kale's passive, that would make D&D less powerful. And that is true, but then that runs into the problem that I was previously discussing around, hey, well, that means that the AP build is, the full AP build is doing exactly the same thing that the on-hit build is doing, where it has less burst, but it has more DPS, right? And then it's kind of infringing a bit upon the on-hit space, right? And so ultimately, my answer to this is, if we really wanted to move Kale away from Dusk and Dawn, I don't think this would probably be the right solution, because this, I think, would necessitate us nerfing in other ways that would likely make it so that the full AP and the heavy AS builds converge towards doing very similar things. And so I think we'd need to find other solutions, right? And as an example, one of the things that we could do here uh, is we could say, okay, Kale, actually, we're going to make it so that building health is worse on you, right? We're going to give you more health per level and less armor and MR per level. We did this to Zeri at one point as an example, to make it so that building health was less good. There are like, basically, I guess my summary, I talked a lot about things that were, I guess hopefully at least tangentially related, and I think that holds up. But ultimately, my answer to this is, I do not think this would be the right way to address the problem, because it runs into a separate problem where, number one, it would be an enormous amount of power. We'd have to cut power elsewhere, and we'd have to figure out where that would come from. That's just already a problem. Number two, even if we cut the power in the place where I think we'd have to cut the power to make it, to move away from Dusk and Dawn, that makes the full AP and the on-hit build much more similar. And so ultimately my answer is, number one, no, literally, like the literal answer to this question is no, there is not room for this. Not without nerfing significantly in other areas. And number two, I don't believe this is the right solution to this statement, even if this was a problem. Which personally, I actually don't think it's a problem that Kale buys Dusk and Dawn. I think that, to me, that seems totally fine. It's like, this is an item that says you get to cheat more attacks against people on a spell cadence. That seems pretty within bounds for Kale to me. Why are there so little marksman champions designed to be played outside of bot lane? So I think there's a lot of different reasons, and I'm going to cover some of them, but I want to be clear that I think there's more than what I'm going to talk about here. I think there's a combination of a lot of different things. I'm going to talk about what I think are probably, for me at least, some of the top reasons, but I'm not going to be covering the entire topic in detail, partially because I'm just not an expert on the area, right? Like, again, this is one of those questions where I would recommend trying to find August streaming and talk to him about it, because I'm sure he has a different perspective and probably better and more accurate thoughts around like some of the historical context here, which I don't have. But I think there's a few different things. One of the big ones is that what it means to be a marksman is that you have a lot of power in a high or most likely 100% reliability, low or effectively zero cooldown effect, right? This, for most of these champions, is the basic attack, right? This is Jinx right clicked on you, you took a bunch of damage, right? And even for a lot of the caster AD carries, they have an auto attack replacement that represents this, right? This is things like Smolder Q, this is things like MF Q. Even champion, even our caster AD carries that are more about casting spells, their spells are basically auto attacks, right? Like, Smolder Q is very high frequency and he just clicks on you and it just happens, right? And so that's a property that marksmen have. Like that's what it means to be a marksman. And that has a lot of implications for what your kit does and how you play in roles. And one of the things that I think ended up being really good about marksman ending up in bot lane was that high DP, like being a DPS champion at range, right? Specifically, also I'm talking about at range, right? Like obviously, there's a lot of auto attackers that are melee, and I'm not talking about them, but specifically about ranged auto attackers, right? Like what it means to be a marksman is that this lends them to have a very, very low variance laning phase, right? Or sorry, very low variance laning phase in the 1v1, and also very, very low variance in just in interactions, especially in more isolated scenarios. And what I mean by this is when you are in range of, say it's Caitlyn mid, right? It's like when you're in range of Caitlyn mid, you just take damage. However, whatever her AD is, you just take that damage, or maybe more if she has a headshot, right? Uh, Compare that to even battle mages, right? Like say like a Cassiopeia, for example. Well, Cassiopeia doesn't want to EU unless her Q is on you, right? That might not even be mana efficient, right? One of the ways that we actually make battle mages interesting in the laning phase is by giving them mana limitations and making it so that there's more context on when and why they want to try and DPS you, right? And they become more and more DPS-y over game time, right? You think of champions like Swain and Rise, and Swain's a particularly good example because his Q cooldown goes down a lot as you go up in level. And so he actually doesn't start the game as a super high DPS champion that just like says, oh, you're in range of me, blast, 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 right? He does that later on in the game, and that's fine, but he doesn't do that super early on in the game, right? He doesn't just go like Q, 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 whereas he does do that, as his Q cooldown goes down later on in the game. Anyway, uh, sorry. To get to the point I'm talking about, this particular point is marksmen have high reliability DPS even early in the game. And one of the things that's great about them going into the bot lane 2v2 is that the support adds a lot of context and variance to how and why you want to trade. Because when you compare that scenario I was just talking about with like Caitlyn auto attacking you versus getting in range of Cassiopeia's E, Cassiopeia has a skill shot to hit. She has to think about her mana costs. She has to consider like, is it worth going for this? Does she want to move forward? Does she want to move back? Caitlyn just says, I'm going to auto attack you. You're going to take damage. And sure, there might be more other context here, right? It's like maybe the Caitlyn doesn't want to auto attack you because she doesn't want to stand still because there's no minions between you and her, and you're going to RE charm her or something like that, right? I'm not saying there's literally no context at all, but it's a lot less innately it's a lot less innately having context than something like a Cassio E or a Rise Q or E or a Swain Q, or insert your favorite like battle mage, which I think battle mages are the best comparison here because they're like the mages that are most similar to AD carries. Even Azir, for example, right, has the context around his soldiers, right? Whereas AD carries don't have context on their auto attacks for the most part, or on their auto attack replacement spells like Smolder Q and MFQ. And so what ends up happening here is that these champions end up being really, really, really flat in early game interactions. Basically interactions in the lower scale, like smaller scale fights in a lot of cases. And so putting them in the bot lane means that there's a lot of extra factors for them to consider that end up generating a lot of interest, right? You have a lot of factors like how close is my support to me? How close is the enemy support to me? Does my support land their spells? How close is my support to the enemy AD carry? Like what's the triangle between me and, my support and the enemy AD carry? What about the triangle between me and my support and the enemy support, right? Like what does that look like? Like there's, so there's 4 different people that have zones of influence in the laning in the lane itself rather than 2. And so the outputs of the laning phase in the 2v2 are a lot less deterministic, right? And you might be thinking, well, you're saying a lot of stuff about this in regards to the laning phase. What about jungle and support? I think jungle and support have their own problems. One of the problems with jungle, and I've talked about this a little bit in previous videos, is that jungle is a role where you can get gold and XP in relative safety, right? Like you don't have to contest a person to get your gold and XP, 95+% of the time. You can, it's much, much, much more difficult to push someone off of farming in the jungle than it is in a lane. And AD carries are the class that has the most multiplicative items in the entire game, right? They have the most multiplicative effects in the entire game. And so they scale the best of all classes. Something that I've noted here, and I think I've noted this in some previous Q&As, is that scaling between classes like that's not created equal, right? People call Draven and Kalista early game champions, but what they actually mean is that their early game is powerful relative to other AD carries, right? Draven and Kalista as early game ADCs are still very powerful late game, right? Like if you go to 25 minutes, would you rather have Draven or a random top laner? Like compositionally, maybe there's compositions where you might rather have the random top laner, but objectively speaking, in terms of output in a fight, most of the time the Draven is going to outperform a random tank, fighter, mage, etc. Later on in the game, just because of how multiplicative the Draven's items are. Even though Draven is a early game ADC, right? Allegedly, right? And same thing for Callista and et cetera, right? These champions just have more multiplicative scalers, and it's more true for what it's worth for the crit marksman than it is for the on-hit marksman. But that don't need to get into all of that distinction. But that's one of the problems with jungle, and one of the things I don't like a lot of the things about Kindred's passive, to be clear. But one of the things that it does do incredibly well that I really appreciate, that I think was executed really effectively on Kindred, is Kindred has her marks as a system that says you don't get to scale for free and just be a really powerful marksman with 3 items at in the team fight at the second Baron or whatever, right? Like, or at the Dragon Soul, right? It's like you just don't get to scale for free. You are forced to interact with your opponents, right? Either ganking, which exposes you to a little bit of risk, or invading the enemy jungle, which exposes you to a lot more risk, in order to actually scale your your spells and your auto attack range. And I think one of the things that I think is particularly compelling about Kindred passive on the current version of the champion is that auto attack range is safety in a lot of ways. And so Kindred, one of the main things she gets from interacting with her opponents and exposing herself to risk is she gets to be safer later on in the game. And so you get to make choices and value judgments about, like, how much range do I need? And of course, they also give her damage and all of that, right? Like, I'm not saying that's the only thing it gives her, but I think that structure makes a lot of sense. Risk now versus risk later is a really compelling structure for the passive to offer you. And there's other reasons why I don't like it. We don't need to get into all of that, but I think Kindred passive is a really good example of what the kind of mechanics that I think makes sense for an AD carry that goes in the jungle. And for what it's worth, we actually, interestingly enough, have a marksman for every role. We have Kindred for the jungle. Technically Graves, though, I don't really, I don't think he really qualifies as a marksman personally. I get that that's like, it makes sense because he's like does a bunch of damage with auto attacks and he can build those items, but like play pattern wise, I don't think he really qualifies. We have Quinn in top lane, who I actually think does qualify as a marksman. She actually does, and she has a very specific pattern, and she has very specific, like very very incredibly sharp strengths and weaknesses to make up for some of the strengths that she does offer in both the laning phase and later on in the game. And she's actually, I would say Quinn is the marksman that actually is the most marksman like of all of the non bot lane marksmen. She actually has in many ways the closest pattern later on in the game to a true marksman. I guess Kindred maybe, depending on how you're considering it. Kindred's a little bit, the jungle part is a little bit weird. Don't need to get into all of that. Mid lane has Akshan, and then support has Senna, right? Akshan and Senna have a lot of similarities. They don't have the same level of DPS as other AD carries, and that's one of the key things you might note about the way that we've designed these is with Senna, what we found was like, well, if she has a real like a regular attack speed ratio and she has the same level of DPS as true AD carries, there's very little incentive to play her in support, and we don't have the power budgeting room to give her effects that are actually compelling as a support, right? And so one of the things we did was we said, okay, that's fine. We'll give her those effects. We'll let those, those utility effects and, the things that she needs to function as a support scale. And we'll say, even though your pattern is about attacking, you're not as good at continuously attacking as, a Jinx or whatever, right? Akshan, a lot of that just came down to trade-offs of like, hey, we wanted him to have some burst and have some interest in his laning pattern in that burst. And the trade-off that we had to make for that was taking away his DPS, or a lot of his DPS, right? He does not have the DPS of a traditional marksman. That's part of where his passive comes from. Anyway, I'm spinning off a little bit and talking about these. Ultimately, I think my answer to this question, if I'm sort of answering in the more general sense, is because we haven't decided to make more of them, right? Like, it's not to say that I think we couldn't make more, but it's more so that by default, we don't make a lot of marksmen in the other roles because it requires an enormous amount of additional consideration and an enormous amount of additional context and work around what is this champion trading off on, and do they really share all the properties of a marksman? Right? Like, do they actually have the power, like the basic attack that scales over game time? Do they build the crit items? Do they build the on-hit items? Like, what does that look like? Right? And there's a lot of extra work to be done there. And generally speaking, we haven't really found a lot of evidence that like players are out there begging for more and more and more marksmen in other roles. What we've found generally, and we've done lots of surveys and stuff around this type of topic and like lots of research around this, is like generally what we found is that AD carries tend to be pretty happy to play their AD carries in the bot lane. And the AD carries, when they go to other roles, actually really like playing other champions. Now, this is not recent. This was some research that was done many, many, many years ago. But actually, it's really funny. I remember seeing a lot of overlap. Many years ago, there were a lot of AD carries back in like what was this, season 8, I think it was, where one of the more common things to do as an AD carry player, if you didn't want to play AD carry or if you wanted to play a solo lane, was you would actually go top lane and you would play like a high scale fighter like a Fiora or a Riven. That was actually like one of the most correlated things with being an AD carry player. And when we dug into that, we were like, do you want to play an AD carry? Those players were like, no, I actually want to go top and I want to play Fiora, I want to play Riven, I don't want to play Quinn, right? And that was like our conclusion there was like, okay, so maybe there's something, there could still be something there. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be something cool that they just weren't imagining that, for an AD carry for them in other roles. But it wasn't something that, we found in our research previously that like players were begging for, that like they really wanted to play a marksman in mid lane or top lane or jungle or support or whatever, right? It's like, it can be a cool thing. And we have a number of these champions, but it doesn't seem like there's some absolutely enormous appetite for this, such that we wanted to drop everything and make tons and tons and tons of these. Is my perspective on this. Anyway, and yeah, to sum it up, I think there's a lot of reasons beyond just what I'm talking about here. This is just, I've kind of covered some of them, but don't consider this answer comprehensive by any means. Scaling champs like Bel'Veth, could other champs also be made into scaling champs? Short answer is yes, but I think I have a lot of caveats here. Something to note is that there is a difference between you are a scaling champion versus you are a Bel'Veth tier scaler on the current patch, right? Bel'Veth currently is one of the most scaling champions in the game, and when I say most scaling, the way that I'm measuring that is what is their win rate in terms of games that end early, and what is their win rate in terms of games that end late? Like, what is their win rate delta over game time? The way that we use this to measure is like Kayle is our benchmark for the hyper carry, right? We want Kayle to be the hyper carry, the late game scaler. She gains over 10% win rate over game time on most patches, right? There's been times when she's been less than that, and that usually results in us wanting to, buffer scaling, maybe nerf her early or whatever, right? Whatever is appropriate for the situation. Bel'Veth is actually similar in power curve to Kayle right now. And so there is a really big difference between that and what I would call like a more lightly scaling champion, something like, say, a Fiora, for example, who I don't know what she is literally on live right now, but like last I was looking at her, last year extensively on her power curve was scaling up around 5 to 6% over game time, which is you are a scaling champion, but you can still win early. It's totally reasonable to win early on that champion, and it's still, you could definitely still lose late game. Whereas when you have like a Kayle or Bel'Veth level scaler on your team, or like Asol is another example of this, you will, you will not be very useful early, and your team will almost, very, very rarely win the game early, and you will be very inevitable late game. And so there's a difference between those things, right? It's like, I'm just trying to make a distinction here of like lightly scaling versus like true hyper carry. I am concerned about true hyper carries. I think we could probably have a few more, though I am wary of like too many games devolving to, oh, well, it's 30 minutes and they have Kayle, guess we lost. Or, oh, it's 30 minutes and they have Bel'Veth, guess we lost. Or, oh, well, we loaded into the game and we had, Asol Bel'Veth, and I guess we just like can't play the game for the first 20 minutes. Like we're just going to get brutalized, and I guess we hope we can stall out somehow. I think that's an experience that is a good thing for League of Legends, but the frequency of that is something that I do think we should moderate. Even lightly scaling, also something that I've just generally been wary of over the past, like, I don't know, 5 to 6, maybe a little more than that years, is we've actually made a lot more scaling over the years in League. We've focused a lot more champion kits into scaling for two main reasons. Number one is a lot of our newer champions, if you look at like, well, I say newer, like champions that were made in like, say, the last 5 years. You look at like Smolder, you look at Asol, you look at like Renata even. Actually, how old is Renata? Now that I'm thinking about it, she's kind of old, isn't she? Well, let's not talk about that. But anyway, a lot of the champions that we've made, like if you look at the percentage-wise of champions that we've made in the last 5 years, most of them are scalers, right? We generally don't make a lot of early game champions. Actually, Locke, I think, is a really good counterexample. Locke is very early game skewed, and I'm very happy about that. I think that's actually really good to have early game champions. Anyway, but we've done a lot of things of like making new champions that scale really hard for a number of different reasons. And one of the things that we did a lot back in like 2019, 2020, 2021 was when champions were, when we wanted to move champions away from pro, our first move, our first response, and we did this because it was really effective, was generally to nerf them early game and make them scale better, right? And we did this to a lot of champions. You think about like Akali, you think about Sylas, you think about Aurelia. We took a lot of these champions that were either relatively flat across game time or in some cases even early game skewed, and we made them either scalers or flatter than they were previously in ways that I think may not have been appropriate. In general, I think League is at its best, champion roster wise, when we have a wide variety of different power curves, and that's part of the interest in the game, and like part of what makes the game compelling is that different games play out really differently and different comps make give you different win conditions. And the more we've pushed more champions towards scaling, like this is one of the things that contributed towards, hey, the whole game is about team fighting. And we've moved away from that, like from a systemic level, right, by some of the objective changes that we've made over the last couple of years. But one of the things that causes a lot of games to not end by like sieges or not end by split pushing or mostly just come down to team fighting, on top of things like Dragon Soul, obviously those have an impact, but we've made a lot more champions about scaling, and we've generally nerfed a lot of early game outputs, and that has led to comps being it being much more difficult to assemble a composition that actually wants to win through pushing down towers in the first 15 minutes of the game or something like that, right? And so this is something where I just think from a holistic perspective, there probably are champions in the game that we could make scale more and that might be appropriate for them. But in the general sense, I do think that on the whole, we should probably take some champions and more early game skew them, return some of the things that we've taken away, nerf some of the scaling we've given. Renekton is a great example of this. If you've ever looked at the numbers on Renekton's ult, that thing is crazy, right? Like it scales in like the scaling on it is insane. It is an obscene spell at the later ranks. And Renekton's early game really is not anywhere close to what it once was. And I think even though he's actually still a pretty, still a moderately early game skewed champion, I think he was better for the game in terms of like offering a really different shape and a really different experience, and offering like a different compositional block for people to pick from, that would then result in very different outcomes and how the game played out later on. He made the game, he made their like added a lot of variance and interest to the game and the compositions and all these situations when he was more early game skewed. And I think that's true of a lot of champions. And so ultimately my answer to this is like, yeah, there are probably some champions that would be better if they were scaling like on an individual, like case by case basis. But I think on the whole, my personal take is that I think the roster as a whole, probably we should, make like stratify power curves more and probably take some champions that we have more flattened or late game skewed over the years and probably undo some of those changes, or even take some champions that could be more early game skewed and do that to them to give us more variety and more interest there. But yeah, overall answer is like, yes, there are probably other champions where them being scaling, more scaling could be more appropriate. Reverse Ornn concept, downgrade enemy items. This is one thing where, even before I get into the specifics of this idea, I will say I don't like it very much just from a philosophical perspective, because I think that in League of Legends, I believe that your gold and your items should generally be pretty sacred. We can upgrade them, right? Like I think upgrading your item is totally awesome, right? But I do not think that we should take away your items unless you yourself are opting into that, right? Like when you buy a Darksail or a Medjay's, you're opting into the experience of, well, I can die and lose this thing, right? That's a totally opt-in experience though. And downgrading enemy items is not something you opted into, right? One of the reasons why I dislike elixirs as an example is that elixirs are so powerful that if you want to win, you actually have to buy elixirs sometimes, right? Like if you're just an optimized player, you will buy elixirs. It's so easy, they're so efficient, they're so powerful. It's like, oh, there's a critical dragon fight coming up. You should buy an elixir, except you're throwing your gold into no permanent progression. And the entirety of League of Legends, the rest of the item system is promising you every gold that you spend is permanent progression that makes your character more powerful. And when we have things that make that not true, I really tend to be very suspicious and generally dislike those things, because I think we should maintain that promise of when you spend gold, your champion is more powerful. And we do not take that away from you. We do not detract from that. We do not degrade the experience of spending gold to make yourself more powerful, because that's one of the core parts of the League of Legends loop that makes League a really fun game to play, is that your character progresses in power over game time. When you level up, you get more powerful. You get gold, you get more powerful, right? And when we betray those things, I think we're actually degrading the experience of playing the game in a pretty damaging way. And so I don't like the concept of downgrading enemy items. Now, I will say, from a design perspective, like there are some viewpoints of design where you could say like downgrading enemy items is really interesting, right? Where it's like, oh, a permanent debuff, and your opponent can, maybe they can repair their items in some way. They can spend gold, or they can go to base, or whatever, right? Uh, I don't love that idea, just generally, as I've already mentioned. Um, but there is some design space here of like a semi-permanent or permanent debuff. The weird thing about it though is like if you're saying it's not permanent, then my question is why is it on their item, right? Like that's kind of how items are in League of Legends. If you want a really long duration debuff, why is it not like say on their health bar or just on their buff bar or visualized in the game world in some way, right? Like downgrading enemy items is basically promising that it's a permanent effect because items in the game are permanent, right? That's how they work. And so to me, I don't really see the point in doing this unless it's permanent, and I don't like it being permanent. And when I look at this design space, as I mentioned, I think there is a viewpoint where permanent enemy debuffs are interesting, right? And you can imagine a bunch of different types of debuffs that could be useful, right? Like as an example, one of the ones that we tested many years ago, right? This was not recent, but one of the debuffs that we've actually tested, that was semi-permanent that we tested quite a bit on champion kits, I think on an item. We tested it in an ARAM as a systemic mechanic. Was this idea of scarring, which was similar to like the way that Cassante ult like locks out part of his health bar. The way that it worked was that through some method of application, whether it was a champion spell or your items made a percentage of your damage do this effect, or in ARAM it was just I think it was a time based thing. I don't remember the exact details. It was a long time ago, but the idea was that your max health would be sort of temporarily locked out until you went to base. And the idea of this was that it would encourage attrition gameplay and allow us to create champions or that were more powerful against healing in a way that didn't mean that the healing had to be ineffective. It just meant that the healing couldn't top you off as effectively. And in an ARAM, it was used as like an attrition mechanic of like you're not allowed to permanently sustain yourself. Of course, again, like I said, this is a long time ago. This was a very different version of ARAM we were testing this for, where sustain and poke were still the best things to be doing back then, which is certainly not the case today. Anyway, we don't need to get into all of that. But universally, what we found when we tested scarring was that it was deeply, deeply, deeply mismatched in terms of satisfaction. Using the mechanic or playing with the mechanic versus how frustrating or unsatisfying it was to be scarred. And I think this is true of a lot of debuffs, just generally speaking, in League of Legends and I think in PvP games, is that debuffs tend to have a pretty poor satisfaction to power ratio. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we should never use them. We have lots of debuffs in the game, and I think a lot of them actually make a lot of sense. Generally, I think most of the debuffs that we have in the game actually makes a lot of sense for us to use. But generally, we do want to prefer mechanics that are more satisfying relative to the power that they have, because, look at champion kits, for example. If you look at their 4 spells and their passive, and you say, well, I'm going to make this champion functional, and there's 2 ways of me doing it. One of them says all of their spells are less satisfying than they are powerful. That's probably not going to be a very fun champion, right? Conversely, you have one champion where, hey, I have one spell that doesn't have a great satisfaction to power ratio, and that's going to carry 25% of the power budget of the spells of their kit or whatever, right? But then I have 3 spells that are actually really good on the satisfaction to power ratio, or maybe even just like 2 that have normal ratios and 1 that has a really, really, really amazing satisfaction to power ratio. And so it's a really satisfying spell that for people to cast, even though it doesn't occupy that much power. In general, one of the things I've talked about before, I think on stream, I don't remember if I've done this, talked about this in Q&As, but I think because AD carries have the auto attack that eats a lot of their power budget, it's actually really important for AD carry kits usually to have at least one spell that has a really, really, really incredible power to satisfaction ratio, even at low levels of power, right? This is a spell like Jin's Trap, for example, where it's not a very powerful spell at all, but it is really satisfying to use, even if it's rarely going to do much for you. And so that actually allows us to allocate a lot of power budget into Jin's passive and his auto attacks without Jin being an unsatisfying champion. And Jin overall is amazing, right? And that's part of what makes him work is that he's leveraging this really, really, really high satisfaction to power ratio on his E. And wrapping that back around to permanent debuffs is permanent debuffs and debuffs in general tend to have very, very, very poor ratios of satisfaction to power, and also tend to be really frustrating for people to play with. And this is one of those things where I kind of compare it to some mechanics that other MOBAs have, like turn rate, for example. It's like turn rate can do some really compelling things for the way that you tune your game, right? Turn rate makes it so that melee carries are, significantly more functional in your game because they can't be infinitely easily kited by range characters that just like auto attack and then walk backwards and continually auto attack as they're walking backwards, right? Kiting, or whatever you want to call it, or walking, auto canceling, whatever your preferred terminology is. Um, and so from some perspective, it's like, yeah, that means that we don't, you can have a character like Master Yi, but he doesn't have to go untargetable all the time, and have all these really powerful tools that some of our melee carries have to be functional. But it comes at pretty substantial downside, which is that your game feels worse to play in a lot of ways, right? Your character is less responsive, right? Like you click the ground and your character does not immediately start moving to that point. And I think that this kind of mechanic is very similar where, yeah, there's a lot of values that we could get out of permanent debuffs or semi-permanent debuffs or really powerful debuffs having them in the game. There's a lot of things that we could do with that from a design perspective. And I don't think we should generally do those things because I think they're not worth the cost that we would pay in order to do those things. Wrapping this back around to the actual pitch here of the reverse Ornn concept where you downgrade enemy items, I don't even think we're getting a super high value out of this personally, right? It's like I'm not seeing the vision of why this would be a particularly great thing for us to have in the game, or like why this would be super satisfying to use. To be clear, there is a player type that really likes debuffs and really likes affecting their enemies and will pay a lot of attention to what their enemies are doing before and after they debuff them. And that's why we have some champions and some effects for those players. But this is one case where I just look at it at a surface level and I say, I just can't really see the vision of how we're going to make this work in a way that makes sense in League and is worth the cost that we're paying, because the costs are very immediately apparent to me that they are extremely high, and the payoff just doesn't seem like it could be very high for this kind of mechanic. And so that's my overall perspective on just like downgrading enemy items. And I think in general, interacting with your enemy's items is not something that I think we're likely to do, just because items and I think experience, like items, I think should be treated very similarly to XP in a lot of ways, where they are permanent, semi-sacred progression to your character, right? It's like, yes, I understand that you can sell your items, you can change your build, but that's like something that happens very rarely. Like, how often do you actually sell a legendary item and buy something else, right? You sell it and you don't undo it, right? Or do something along those lines. Very, 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 very rarely. 99.9% of games are played where no one in the game is selling an item to buy a different legendary, or like selling their boots to buy different boots even, right? This is a mechanic that's like technically part of the game, but in actual practice, item progression is permanent, and I think it should remain so. And I think that's actually important. Again, reiterating, like I think that's really, really, really important for the satisfaction of progressing your character throughout the game of League of Legends, that you get more powerful, and we don't betray that by sometimes making your items worse, or taking away some of those things that you get, or taking away your gold, or any of those kinds of things. For what it's worth, I think it'd be actually more in bounds to take away someone's unspent gold than it would be to take away their items, right? Because you haven't actually spent that gold yet. We've made you a promise of like, you took that plate and or you got that kill and you can convert that into permanent progression, but you haven't actually done the step where you converted that into permanent progression yet. And so that's like the place to where I would be thinking about playing if we really wanted to do that. Not that I think that's a particularly great road to go down, but I think it's better than like actually interacting with the items. Anyway, that's my thought on this area, or this topic. When do some AD champions get AP ratios, and when do they not get any AP ratios? And this person was talking specifically about Yunara versus Xayah. I'm going to give some examples. I will state up front that we have a general set of guidelines for this, but we often just do what we feel is best for an individual champion or for a class, more so than have like a hard set of rules around like, this must do, like X kind of spell must do Y, or these kinds of spells must do A, B, and C, right? It's more guidelines in general. Looking at this specific case of Yunara versus Xayah, one of the a lot of the core reasons why these champions are different are that they're different subclasses, right? Yunara is a traditional right clicker. She's supposed to do a lot of raw DPS and not really be about her spells. And Zaya is a caster, right? She is supposed to be a lot about her spells. Her auto attacks are supposed to matter, right? But she's supposed to be a lot more of a caster, where your spells are what you're playing around. In addition, layered on top of your auto attacks, more a champion like Lucian, whereas Yunara is supposed to be much more similar to someone like a Jinx, right? And one of the things that causes these differences is with Yunara, we gave her a lot of magic damage, both for theming reasons and also because we want those effects to scale with her, her primary penetration, right? If she bought like an LDR or a Mortal or whatever, right? We were making a lot of effects on her kit that we didn't actually want to scale, with uh, percent penetration purchases. And one of the other things that we do with a lot of on hits, like Yunara's Q passive and her actual passive, is we often make on hit effects not physical damage, right? Like magic damage or true damage, partially for visibility reasons, right? When you hit someone with your on hit effect, it's a lot easier to tell what that on hit is doing if it's a different damage type than your basic attack, right? Blade of the Ruined King, for example, it's a lot harder to tell what your Bork is doing for you because it's a physical damage on hit comparatively to something like a Wit's End or a Yunara Q passive or a Varus W passive, right? Kind of on hit, or like Master Yi's E, because it's not like Blade of the Ruined King is very low visibility. Your auto attacks just do a different amount of physical damage, but you can't see a visible change in the text aside from the number being slightly different than from when you had the Blade of the Ruined, or from when before you got the Blade of the Ruined King, right? And so a lot of what this ends up being derived from on Yunara's kit is like, okay, well, we want these on hit effects to be magic damage, so they're clearly visible and different from the auto attack itself. And then that leads us down this road of like, okay, she's going to have a bunch of magic damage, on hit effects. And then, what does that mean for the rest of her kit? Specifically the RW, talking through that, one of the reasons why that scales really 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 well with AD is because it has a very very highly ceremonialized long cast time, right? Even at its highest attack speed breakpoint, like the cast time on the RW scales with attack speed, it's still a 0.45 second cast, which is almost twice as long as a standard cast time, right? You're essentially disabling your attacks. And one of the things that we've done over the years with AD carries is we've generally tried to make it so that if we have an attack replacement effect for them, it actually is, it doesn't become DPS negative to use it, right? Especially if it can miss. And so one of the things with Yunara W is it kind of has to scale really well with AD in order to function on her kit, or she'll just stop using it when her auto attacks get to a sufficient level of damage. And we didn't want that, and so we gave it a really big AD ratio. And then it has an AP ratio because it's presented as this highly ceremonialized like caster moment, like unique caster moment for a raw auto attacking AD, right? Like this is like a unique thing that she does comparatively to other raw auto attackers like say Jinx in the game, or like Caitlyn or whatever, right? Anyway, Zaya doesn't get AP ratios because she doesn't have any magic damage on her kit. Like, where would you want the AP ratio to go? Right? We very, very rarely put AP ratios on physical damage, and I think a lot of the cases where we have it in the game right now are kind of like nonsensical, right? Like Tryndamere E, for example, doesn't really make sense for it to have an AP ratio. It's grandfathered in. I think it's fine, right? I'm not saying it's like it's like, oh, it's so bad and we have to get rid of that. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is that if we made Tryndamere today, we wouldn't put an AP ratio on a Z, I don't think, because it doesn't really have any, like, it doesn't really follow in with any of the logic that we have around what spells get AP ratios and AD ratios. Generally speaking, if we have an AP ratio on something, it's probably because it's we want it to scale with something, and it's usually going to be magic damage, right? Especially if it's on a non-primary AP building champion. In general, there's a strong connection between building AP and doing more magic damage. And so when we have a random magic damage spell on, say, like an AD carry, we're generally going to give that, primarily an AP ratio, because, and one of the differences that is here that I want to be very clear about is that physical damage and magic damage are not the same thing. Right, people kind of look at them and say like, oh, these are just really different types of damage, but they're like they're different cosmetically, but they're the same. But we don't actually treat them the same from a systemic perspective, right? People get way more armor per level than they get MR per level, and people are also way more likely to buy armor than they are to buy MR. And they're if they buy armor, they're going to get a lot more armor, typically speaking, than they're getting MR in general, right? Like tanks at the end of the game, a typical tank build will end the game at 250 to 300 plus armor, but rarely will they ever get above 200 MR, as an example, right? And so one of the key things here is that often when we want to make a spell that doesn't have to deal, like doesn't have to concern itself with the enemy getting stronger against it over game time, right? Which that is the case for all physical damage in the entire game because people just get a lot of armor per level, and that was true even before the durability patch. To be clear, is we often make that spell magic damage, right? One of the things that has been true though over the years is that some of our magic damage spells that we have on AD carries, we've actually added AD ratios to them to make sure they're worth casting and to enabled us to tune these champions in certain specific ways. Tristana ult I think is a really good example of this. Of like Tristana ult for most of her lifetime, and in fact for most of League of Legends lifetime, was a magic damage spell that did not scale with AD. And so for Tristana as a normal AD carry, right? Not AP Tristana, right? But just normal AD carry Tristana. It was purely a I ult this person to get them away from me, not I ult this person, well, I mean, it also did, good base damage, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it was useless for damage, but that damage did not scale with your primary stats, stat that you were building. And one of the reasons why we undid that was that, that was one of the things that was done to unbind Tristana a little bit from mid lane to make her more about gold scaling and less about XP scaling. We don't need to get into all of that, but another example that I think is relevant here is Gangplank Ultimate. Gangplank Ultimate is magic damage that does not scale with AD at all. It's relatively agnostic over game time, because it's magic damage and people rarely build MR, right? It's like the damage that it deals at, like 6 minutes when Gangplank it just has 1 point in the ultimate is actually pretty similar to what it deals at 9 minutes when people have leveled up a few times. Like it's not going to deal significantly less damage. And one of the values that we get out of Gangplank ult being magic damage, not only does it mean that it just deals relatively similar damage over game time, but it also means that Gangplank who is behind and Gangplank who is ahead don't have substantially different ultimates. Sometimes it'll be a little different just because the ahead Gangplank will have more XP on average and will have a little bit more base damage on the ultimate, but it gives Gangplank a real fallback mechanism. Whereas the version of Gangplank where the ultimate, like say, deals physical damage and scales with AD, more in line with his primary build, that actually makes Gangplank a more extreme feast or famine character, right? And so one of the things that we often do with these kinds of effects is we try to use them to make champion kits less extreme when a lot of the rest of the kit is either low utility or very feast or famine in other ways, right? Like, Gangplank is, I think, a particularly great example of this because he doesn't really offer much at all in terms of utility or value on his kit besides his multiplicative damage scaling. That's the thing that he does. He has a cleanse, right? He has a heal. He can survive some things, and so he has some value outside of just I blow people up instantly with barrels, right? But a lot of the utility that he brings to his team is through his ultimate. I think it makes a lot of sense for him to have a magic damage spell that does not scale with AD there, as this will always be useful even if you're behind. Whereas we'd have to make it less powerful if it scaled with AD, which would make it a more extreme difference between ahead Gangplank versus behind Gangplank. Or if it dealt physical damage, because then it just have to do more damage, and then it scales with your penetration that you're buying for AD Gangplank. Anyway, moving away from the examples that I'm giving here, more specifically to Yunara versus Xayah, again, because Yunara is a core auto attacker, and then we gave her a lot of magic damage, both for thematic reasons and for visibility reasons, she ends up with, well, she has AP ratios on those things because we generally want most effects in the game to scale with something. Like there's a promise in League of Legends that we're giving you that you can scale through the game, and in an ideal world, you could scale anything on your kit to do to be more powerful. And when you look at Xayah, it's, well, these things all scale on your primary build, right? She doesn't need any of those AP ratios. They don't really make sense on her because, number one, she's not dealing magic damage. Number two, she already has ways of scaling all of the effects on her kit with her primary build. And so she doesn't need any of those things. Whereas, like, with Yunara, as an example, I don't actually think the AP ratio on her passive is a necessity for her to function. Like, we could take that out, and I think that would be totally fine for the character. She works fine. But it's kind of a fun bonus thing, right, that can be there. And I think that, especially with how great Mayhem has done, and like how popular like Mayhem and like other modes, like Arena have showcased like some of the cool things that can be done when we have some more of these cool off-build ratios that can be hooked into by systems. Like, even if they're not things that are actually super functional for SR or like typically accessed in SR, that can be really good if we have the right hooks to tie into. But when I look at Xayah, I don't actually see any of those hooks that make sense for her, right? Where I ask, where is the AP ratio supposed to go? Again, she's not dealing any magic damage, and so if I see a Zaya with Death Cap, what am I supposed to expect her to do? Right? Whereas when I see a Yunara with Death Cap, I say, oh, her spells will probably do a lot of damage. And then you can sort of interpolate from there, like, oh, yeah, also, she has this on hit effect, so she might do some magic damage with her attacks. Okay, cool. I understand what that looks like because Kale and Varus also do that, right? Like, I've seen that before, and there's some champions that are even built entirely around that, like, Kale and Gwen and stuff like that, right? Whereas when I look at Zaya, I don't say, um, oh, well, we could throw this AP ratio on this thing, right? As an example, if we said, hey, the damage from feathers is magic damage, I would say, okay, cool. That's a good, like, that could be a really cool tie-in for Zaya to have uh an AP ratio, right? If we were saying, like, actually we want Zaya's, pass through damage to be really consistent over game time and scale less with her items. We want her to have, exactly this amount of harassment through the wave power, as an example, right? If we wanted to do that, I'm not saying we do or we would ever want to do that. I'm just using it as an example. But if that was something that we were saying, that would make me come to the conclusion, well, those, like, if we're making the feathers magic, like the pass through feathers magic damage, they should scale with AP, right? Like, they should probably scale with something. And AP, I think, makes sense. Maybe they're also supposed to scale with AD, depending on why we're doing this change, right? But in general, ultimately, the simple answer to Yunar versus Zaya is Zaya doesn't deal any magic damage, and she doesn't have any places where it would make sense to put an AP ratio. Whereas Yunara has a lot of magic damage, and she has a lot of places where it makes sense that, hey, you're a caster, or like this is like a caster-ish. You're not a caster, sorry, that's bad phrasing. You have a caster-ish spell that is on a AD carry that is about primarily attacking. We can give you an AD ratio in some cases where, like, you're trading off on your ability to attack because of the long cast time on RW, or alternately, we're giving you an AP ratio because, hey, this is a caster output, and therefore we can give you a cool ratio that you're not actually going to access in a primary game, but or in a SR game, but you can access in, like, other off modes, or if you're just playing normals with your friends or whatever, or doing stuff like that. Hopefully, this is a comprehensive answer, or a useful answer. But I guess before I close this question out, just like as a final statement, uh, like I said at the beginning, there is no universal, like, set of hard rules. What we end up doing a lot of the time is, hey, AP is generally linked to magic damage, AD is generally linked to physical damage, and uh, what we do for, like, after that often just it gets derived from what is the correct thing for this character, or like what is the correct thing for this class, or the structure of the kit that we have, right? We don't have sacred things here, right? As an example, if someone came to me and said, I want to lower the base damage on Varus's ultimate and make it scale with AD, I would say, okay, I think there are reasons why that might make sense, right? Like, I could see like lines of reasoning that would lead you to that conclusion, similar to what we did with, like, Tristana Ultimate, right? It's like, oh, if this is about making Varus scale better with gold in his primary builds, as one example of what that might look like. I'm not saying we must do that, right? But that, if we want the kit to be shaped in that way, sure, right? Like, if it's better for the champion for them to do that, we don't have hard rules that say, like, all magic damage must be AP scaling only, or all physical damage must be AD scaling only, right? Like, we have all sorts of other things in the game if that's right for the champion. But a lot of this just comes down to what can we do, what can we open up, and what makes sense and what is readable for your opponents. Like what happens when they see these items in your inventory? Like, what do they interpret that as meaning, and what do you interpret that as meaning on the champion? And, like, is that something that can be interpreted? All those things matter here. Anyway, thanks for watching. That's going to be it for today for number 36. It's a bit of a longer one, a little bit longer. Some of these questions were pretty long answers. And yeah, thanks for watching, and catch you maybe in number 37.